Hello and welcome to B3. This time it's not me hosting the B3 in-depth series, but we are right in the B3 conference and festival. But it is my pleasure to again welcome Dr. Julie Carpenter because we have talked before a couple of months ago, but it is so great to have you here at the biennial of the moving image at the festival as part of a little fireside chat with you.
Yeah,
It's good to
thank
see
you.
you.
Thank you. It's good to see you. It's always good to see you, Johan. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And of course, I would like to introduce you. So, you are a research scientist based in San Francisco, and you are specifically interested in the risk and the ethical and social impact of emerging sciences and technologies, specifically also about artificial intelligence. So the fireside chat has the title on artificial intelligence, science fiction or reality, a realistic look into the future of AI. But because you're also very much interested in the history of cinema and cinematic storytelling, I would actually like to combine that. I would like to pick your brain about AI, the past of AI, the future of AI, but also the future of narrative and visual storytelling and how we can combine that. Because so that actually would also be my first question. If we talk about AI, then most people think of robots and C3PO or something like that, Star Wars, Star Trek, etc. Uh, and I think I have the feeling that a lot of the real dangers and also the real potential of AI is almost kind of like hidden because there is such a massive pop cultural idea of what AI is. And that doesn't, at least from my perspective, not overlap at all with the reality of AI. Reality of AI is something a little bit more profane, I would say, or less glamorous, let's call it. What is your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's a lot clunkier in person, right? I mean, AI is this very mysterious term for what's essentially a kind of computer programming. And we've turned it into this sort of mysterious term because largely people don't understand that. And even people within AI will all have different definitions of what it is or what their goals are. So it's really an umbrella term for a lot of different subjective goals. Those goals are corporate, they're industrial, they're private, they're by NGOs, they're by individuals. So all of these different things. Yeah, and in science fiction, you're right, robots or holograms, things that are embodied, that look physically like people a lot, or sometimes animals. That seems to be an easiest way to present the AI in a narrative and a story in a way that's going to capture our imagination and also make it somewhat understandable, which is one reason sometimes we use human-like design cues for AI in real life. It gives you hints about how to interact with it, right? But if something looks like a human or an animal, then we tend to treat it that way, at least initially, because if you told me you were a robot, right? I'm going to assume that you can talk and that you can make eye contact with me and that you're moving, and if you have two legs you can walk, and I give you all these characteristics and attributes about thinking and talking and stuff that makes you seem like this realistic human-like other, when really you might resemble a human, but of course you're not. Your experiences are different as a robot. Your senses could be completely different. You could have powers that I don't have, lasers shooting out of your eyes, or infrared vision, or super hearing. You perceive the world differently than I do. You have different goals and intentions that have nothing to do with passion or inspiration or any human-like motivations, greed or happiness or anything like that. Your goals are algorithmic. At least at this point, we're talking about sort of the science fiction portrayal, like you were saying, versus the reality today. The reality today is that even when robots appear human-like, they're really not human-like intelligence, even anything close. though that's the goal for some people, or when it looks animal-like. It's not even, they're what we call biomimetic. They're imitating biological entities for various reasons. It could be functionality. It could be to give you those cues about how to relate to it. But yeah, there's this huge gap between what's portrayed to tell an interesting and entertaining story and the science fiction writers writing using their imagination about what things could be in the future. And it's a way to explore what makes us human versus what's not, or what we would prefer to not think about. Some of our, let's say, baser and more difficult to explain emotions and feelings, we can reflect those in these unfeeling robots. They're great for stories, right? But again, like you were saying, in reality, they're currently not that intelligent, though the engineering is amazing, right? We see on YouTube and, TikTok and whatever, all of these amazing clips of robots that can do functionally task-oriented, goal-oriented things, walking, running, balancing on 2 legs or 4 legs, things these are almost commonplace in the last 10 years. And prior to that, they were not. I mean, you had robots still tethered to things. They couldn't walk, the whole robots have come so far in engineering, but not really, still in intelligence, but not approaching human-like intelligence. And that's the big gap. People expect that robots have human-like anything, and they don't really. They don't have human-like touchstones of understanding or feeling or emotion or thought or self-awareness or an understanding of life or death. So big difference, right?
Absolutely. So from your perspective, what do you think will be the next like huge step in AI evolution? So where you would actually say like, well, this is something that I haven't expected so early, or this is something that is a kind of game changer. Or
Well,
am I too thinking like in Silicon Valley, like VP terms now?
well, no, I mean, you are, but there's also, I've worked in labs where specifically that was my job, is to think 20, 30, 40, 50, whatever years in advance. And of course, I live in San Francisco in the Bay Area, so I'm immersed in that sort of
Mhm.
line of thinking all the time. So it's not unusual. Of course, I've often said this, that I think the holy grail, if it is the human-like intelligence. And that's so poorly defined, in part because we don't agree on what human intelligence really is. Um, Alan Turing knew that it was poorly defined. That's why in the Turing test, in his paper that he wrote about it when he proposed the imitation game, he talked about a thinking machine, not something that really had human intelligence, or he avoided the word intelligence for that reason. He preferred the word thinking, which I think in many ways it was a smarter way of putting it. Is it thinking? Is it sort of sentient? Does it have an awareness? Can it make its own decisions and learn? And we're at that point where AI can learn from its environment. In fact, one definition of a robot, only one definition, would be that it's a computer or a mechanical device that is embodied and smart enough that it can, intelligent enough that it can learn from its environment and interact with it. So we do have things like machine learning now. But as far as approaching artificial general intelligence or something that's human-like, sometimes it's called friendly intelligence, things like that. That's the holy grail. That's what people really want. And it's funny, it always sounds funny to me. It's a funny goal, isn't it? Why? Because why, when it's so ill-defined, what our intelligence, why have that as the goal? Why mold it exactly in our image? I just got done saying in my previous answer, robots have completely different capabilities and experience. It would be nice for them to have a sympathy for us and an understanding of our lived experience, right? especially if they're going to be these highly intelligent machines we interact with every day in all of these different roles in our lives. It would be nice for them to have that understanding, and it would behoove them. They would be better at their functionality. But for them to have this human-like intelligence, or something that achieves human intelligence or surpasses it, sometimes that's the definition of the singularity. To me, that's a goal for a lot of people, futurists, some futurists, people in the Bay Area, people in labs, whatever. But I think it's a nebulous goal, as Turing said. I agree with him. And I'm not sure what its purpose is. A robot can be highly intelligent and have robot intelligence. It can know the world in its own way. I was talking about some of the physical differences. If it has supervision and super hearing, and what I mean by super is extended way beyond abilities that we could do, this incredible strength or something, it's going to understand the world in a way differently than we will ever understand it. So that's fine. It's robot intelligence, sort of like when we live with animals, right? We don't understand the world the way, like I have 2 cats as pets, right? I don't understand the world the way the cats think, right? But I can still live with them and interact with them. I don't know that my life is necessarily more productive because of them, right? Because they're cats. But so what the point I'm making is that you can interact with something in a friendly way, in an affectionate way, in an intelligent way, even, and it doesn't have to have a human intelligence for you to communicate with it.
It's a friendly way of coexisting, I guess.
Yes,
Or you,
coexisting, collaborating, and cooperating, right?
mhm.
Well, not with cats so much. They're not good
Yeah,
at cooperating or collaborating.
yeah. Well, I'm a huge fan of Ian M. Banks. I'm not sure if you're familiar with his work. He died a couple of years ago. He's one of my favorite science fiction authors, and his utopian, anarchistic future is dealing with the AI problem, or like how to envision how a future, like coexisting or living with artificial intelligences that are so much more superior or intelligent than we are, that he kind of says like, well, it doesn't really, for him in his stories, it doesn't really matter. It's almost like a form of like, well, like we do our thing, they do their thing, and sometimes they help us and sometimes they need us, and it will just be something interesting and emergent, but there's hardly a way of telling how that will be.
Right.
Yeah,
I mean, if you want to look for sort of a positive science fiction example, what came to mind while you were talking was C3PO, right?
yeah,
And that's a great example because he's so well spoken, right?
yeah.
That's his whole thing. He's an etiquette droid, right? But he's smarter than any human could ever be. He speaks like hundreds of languages fluently. And in many ways, he's smarter and more
Mhm.
intelligent than a human, right? But first of all, like you said, everybody can still interact with C3PO in a friendly way. Sure, he can be superior and obnoxious sometimes, right? But he's lovable. He's become a lovable part of the Star Wars myth. And that shows a model. I mean, we also interact with people smarter than us every day, right? But that doesn't mean that there's automatically animosity or that you can't talk to them or whatever. So I think that that's, shows one model, but also C3PO has these tremendous flaws and gaps in his knowledge and things where he constantly, that's the humor
And
part,
I mean,
right?
he can't even properly walk.
Yeah,
He's just
he
like,
can't even I don't know how he would have survived as long as he did, right? I mean, he can't even properly walk because he wasn't made for that. But he obviously has his own problems in addition to
yeah,
mobility. There are a lot of times where he can't figure out the human point of view, and that makes him fall short. And it's sort of that makes me think of that. And of course, then somebody's going to watch this and say, but now she's referring to science fiction as a model of real life. But that's the thing. It's a story like what you were saying. It's a great illustration of how we might interact with some kinds of AI.
yeah,
That's one reason sci-fi is so fun, right? It's an exploration of what's going to happen,
yeah.
what could happen.
Yeah, sci-fi most of the time is really fun and very imaginative. most of the time, even if you look back to the 70s and see how they predicted the future, I mean, nobody really thought about something like the internet, although the internet even existed when those science fiction authors were writing about the future. So the future kind of like made a kind of like different turn in a certain way than like where the flying cars. I mean, we are getting there, and like there are drones that can lift people in the meantime and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But the future arrived in a different flavor, I have the feeling.
That's true. I mean, that's kind of an internet joke now, right? Where are the flying cars? And speaking of that, that often makes me think, right, of the Jetsons, because I think typically we've talked about the Jetsons before. The Jetsons now is a cartoon that's almost 50 years old. And as you corrected me or reminded me last time we spoke about the Jetsons, it actually was an offshoot of the Flintstones, oddly enough, which is about cave people, right? Primitive, super bizarre people. But then Jetsons was this offshoot of this. I'm amazed people still use it as a reference. It must be in reruns forever, but futuristic flying cars, similar sort of family, husband, wife, dog, two kids, right? But they live in the future. And they still use Jetsons references every day. Amazon just released a robot called Astro, which was the Jetsons dog. And now there's all these headlines on, about Astro and the Jetsons. And, so there have been several robots named Rosie after the maid robot in the Jetsons. And we still see Jetsons headlines for all sorts of ways of framing AI again in the media. So no, we did take a turn, but yet we didn't take a turn. We're still going back to those older references, which is sort of, that one in particular is really interesting to me. There's a lot in that metaphor you and I have talked about that's lacking, right? It's pretty old, it's pretty dated. It's a very narrow idea of not only what the future is, but what a family should be and gender roles and all sorts of things. And yet we're using it as a model for the future. So can we lose the Jetsons metaphor, everybody?
Oh yeah, sure.
Can we all
I'm for it.
agree?
I'm for it. My vote.
Can we
Yes,
all agree?
yes, yes, yes. And I mean, in the meantime, there are TV series like, for example, Futurama, that is actually taking those tropes and I don't like do with them what they deserve, like being taken apart and ripped apart and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it's strange sometimes those original references or these original stories are only known anymore as satires and parodies. So like like that we still have the symbol of a disc to save things, but young people don't even know what the disc is anymore,
I
it's
saw
just
that
like
going around the
remains.
other day on Twitter. People were talking about that. I think somebody had remarked that their students didn't know what the icons meant anymore. And it's true. It's that's makes sense.
They're,
They're
they're
pretty old.
hieroglyphs from an old time.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. But let's talk a little bit about the future and also like the positive uh, or interesting narratives there are. You already mentioned the singularity. The
Mhm.
singularity is like an interesting trope where the super intelligence will arrive, or we will all. It's almost like a very Christian teleology where we arrive in the bright light, and where we all be able to live forever in a computer or something like that. And it seems to me, like from a political perspective, that most of the people who like to talk about that or are craving the singularity seem to be hardcore libertarians. Is there a coincidence there, or
Boy,
what do you
you're,
think?
you're, you're asking me, boy, am I setting myself up to be spammed by people? Yeah, so that is an interesting question. And there probably is a Venn circle. I would guess that you are correct. That's right. And I think that I'm going to guess, I'm not a clinical psychologist, so I don't analyze people, but I am a cultural psychologist. I look at groups of people and how people interact within cultures. And I would say that people who identify as libertarians and who identify as futurists probably think of themselves as very independent thinkers. generally. And so I could see where that would attract, then if you're going to be in a group like futurists, you're going to then attract people who consider themselves independent thinkers, like libertarians. So I think that that's probably some of that overlap. But yeah, the futurists, interesting sets of ideas, the singularity. I guess, yeah, the singularity is an interesting concept. Is that you can tell I'm a little uncomfortable talking
Yeah.
about it, because I guess I there are two ways I'm sort of uncomfortable with it. One is I guess it's interesting intellectually if something achieves a human-like intelligence or surpasses it. But I just got done talking about all the reasons why I don't think that that's exactly accurate, something that we're going to see. We might see an AI that has great sympathy and understanding of the human experience, but they're not going to have that intelligence. We have no way of really measuring that unless you're looking strictly at IQ, which again is not a measure of human intelligence. So there's that whole thing I got done talking about. And then there's that whole but why that I also said, but why? Let robots, let AI in whatever form be AI and what it's good at. Let's create an environment in research and development. And when we're thinking about the goals and objectives of AI, to let AI do what it's best at and let it be AI. And the other thing, I guess, about singularity that makes me uncomfortable is that I'm not sure how it's going to create a utopia or a dystopia, frankly. I'm not sure it's the event that people are hoping for. It's not the white light flashing or anything. It will be, if something like that happens and we can identify when it happens, it will sure be an interesting achievement. It will certainly be a technological and cultural benchmark. But I guess I'm not winning any friends in the futurist or singularity lovers club with my response, but that's how I feel sort of about the singularity.
Okay, but I generally have the feeling that they don't like sociologists like that, anyways. So it's
Well,
they're
I do have to say, futurists have made me feel pretty welcome in a lot because my work is going to appeal to a lot of people. I do talk about the future, but my particular opinions on the singularity, no, probably not too popular.
okay. Well, let's go back to the to cinema, and cinema is a very, of course, visual medium, and I have the feeling in the last years that there's so much stuff happening in AI. Like I mean, there are things that still astound me. For example, Adobe just released this text to speech kind of like app for Premiere, where you pretty much like can edit a film and it automatically creates subtitles. It really perfectly understands the English language and does subtitles. Something that I would not have guessed would exist like five. If you would have asked me 5 years ago, I would have told you no, this is not possible. But at that quality level, it is just like mind blowing what is happening right now in just like consumer software applications. But I think most of the films dealing with AI or the future seem to be incredibly boring in a certain way, because some of that stuff is so hard to portray. I think I can only guess like one of the best films in that area in the last couple of years was Her, because it was making a really poignant like statement about how we fall in love with our devices in a certain way. Yeah? But what do you think? Like, what can we do to make uh, the debate about AI more interesting also in storytelling? Because it seems the stories are all the same. They're like Frankenstein stories and stuff like that, and it's just like repeating the same blah 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 again and again and again. And I think like the really interesting things that we should tackle, those stories are never being told.
I Well, I'm biased, but I think you're right. I lean towards more stories about people living with AI, like her, or even Lars and the Real Girl, to go back a few years, or AI, the movie, Spielberg movie, or, even there are some of the more recent, even Chappie and Blomkamp and stuff has done stuff about the future with robots. Of course, that's war, but still people living with robots and exploring and negotiating those relationships are more interesting to me as well than seeing that Frankenstein trope, that creationist. It is very much have a Christian root in it when the storylines that you're talking about, that framing of creation, a creation that gets out of control. It's a creation often done by a man. That creation is often a woman or a female gendered robot or hologram or AI or whatever it is. And it goes out of control, and, all hell breaks loose. Though, I enjoy those stories as well, since we've talked about repeatedly Blade Runner is my favorite film. That's AI gone wrong, right? There's fun to those, but part of that film as well is Deckard exploring his relationship with Rachel, right? It doesn't have to be romance. It's about that whole idea of the deep emotional engagement, about meaningfulness, and about AI becoming social actors in our lives, and even a new social category. And how do we as humans navigate that? Knowing that these things are not human, knowing the pitfalls that are potential in a relationship, whether it's a friendship and platonic or romantic, um, and exploiting the good parts of that, maybe to make you feel better in the moment. Like Lars and the Real Girl, he uses a feminine sort of, actually it's a sex doll, not a robot, right? Sort of as a self-therapy to get him through some lonely times. And in her, Joaquin Phoenix's character falls in love with this disembodied AI operating system. Also, sort of, it's romantic, but it also sort of therapeutic, right? Because in the end, it brings him around to understanding himself and people better. So I agree that sort of intellectual, how are we going to figure out what the limitations of our relationships with AI are, and that they're not necessarily substitutes for human relationships or animal friendships or anything else, because that's often what we see, her being an example, right? Is that they're presented as a substitute, but they don't have to be a substitute for human relationships. They can be add-ons, right? They can be sort of, again, to bring up that animal metaphor. I can have pets and I can have human friends and a human network, right? And maybe someday I'll have a robot that's meaningful to me socially, that I interact with in an intelligent way, but that doesn't necessarily replace or substitute my human friends or relationships or similar.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. This idea of that we are, of course, as we know, that like surrounded by different friend circles and different uh, entities that we deal in different ways. So why not? Yeah, like it's not. I'm, for example, like it's Saturday evening and I'm not social enough to meet my human friends, but I can definitely hang out with my AI bots at home and have a
Right.
good
And
time.
one of the things that can be a limitation or an ability, a capability, a plus with something like that is, like in your example, maybe you watch a movie with your AI buddy or something, and then you can turn it off. And, in some situations, the fact that AI can go away could be tragic, like in her, right?
Yeah.
Because that could be the end of things. But in that situation, that's great, because then you just want to go to bed. You don't want a big deal with saying goodbye or trying to gently hint that they should go home or whatever it is. You could just stop. Or then you could text your friends or, whatever it is. So learning how to negotiate, and that I should point out too, that's clearly socially, you've been social then with that AI in that situation. You watched a movie together, but you treated it differently than you would a person friend, because at the end you just turned it off when you were bored, right? And so this is where some people get really worried. And then they go, but what if I've learned to do that and I start to do that with people and I just act really rude? Well, then people are going to push back and they're going to be like, what the hell, dude? You know,
Yeah.
you can't just walk away. So two things are going to happen, in my opinion. One is somebody pushes back and says that behavior is inappropriate, and or over time we learn that that's not necessarily acceptable, but it's okay behavior because we've learned that we don't have to have a big social to do at the end. Let me give a better, maybe an example about how all technology changes how we behave. Everything is going to change. The simplest technologies change how we behave. But here's an example. This was, I don't know, maybe even 10, 15 years ago, but I hate bringing up the examples of mothers that are not perfect with technology because I think that's a really bad stereotype, right? But in this case, I'm going to bring up a miscommunication I had with my own mother. My mother hates typing, and for a long time, she really resisted email. Very intelligent woman, loves reading, loves writing letters, hated email for a long time, was very resistant. I, of course, was immersed in email at work and everything and got very used to writing the way we write emails, you know, see you soon, whatever. So I would write my mother these emails, you know, see you next Friday for dinner, love Julie, that was it. I had no idea that this was really hurting her feelings until one day when I was talking to her on the phone, and I was still writing letters to my grandfather at the time because he couldn't see, and she would read my letters to him. And she said, you write such beautiful, loving, long letters to your grandfather. And then the emails I get from you are, see you next Friday, you know, bye, Julie.
Oh.
And it was really hurting her feelings that I didn't start dear mom, you know, and have a very formal letter structure, right? And so that's a way that, and we had to communicate and talk things through. And I realized she likes a little more structure and information in her email. And but that's where email had changed my behavior, right? And there was that, an age gap, in this case, a generational gap or a technology gap in how she was using or expected to use the technology, which she saw it's based on letter writing, right? So she expected that sort of format and etiquette. I had already been immersed in email for years. Email had changed the way I communicated in a written form. And I had one way of writing in letters, the way I still wrote to my grandfather and fulfilled his expectations, you know, dear Upa, you
Yeah.
know, and all of that. And with mom, I had taken on this different way in email, a different medium. So, but that's a long explanation, but I think it's sort of a good one that has a lot of parallels. It shows how it changes the way we communicate sometimes. It's not necessarily bad. There's an adjustment period. I don't think it's necessarily bad in email that you can write shorter notes and be less formal, right? Or you can choose to be more formal, you know, but that negotiation is something that we're going to go through for a long time.
I just today wrote a friend like I think it was like a text message or something like that, and he completely misunderstood my text message. He thought that I was totally like passive aggressive in what I wrote, and in the end, like we had a phone call and everything was good. And I Googled a little bit about the psychology of texting and writing chat messages. And there is a whole discipline of people
Yeah.
who try to analyze how the generational shift of how you use uh, chat interfaces as a millennial or a Gen X or a boomer and stuff like that. And this is enormously fascinating to me. That like, what's the difference between a semicolon or three dots or something like that? And three dots might be seen as passive aggressive, but a dash is and stuff like that. You know, but
And
it's
the
something
famous
that
all caps thing, right?
yeah yeah
You know,
yeah
if somebody has no idea that all caps sounds like you're shouting, right? People still do that, make that mistake sometimes. You know, and you're like, why are you shouting at me? Right.
yeah.
So, yeah.
No, it's fascinating that. all these like new technologies and new ways of dealing with technology are also generating and creating its own cultures and its own bubbles and its own cultural grammars, let's call it.
Yeah, and it's very rapid now, but not only is it rapid, but we have ways of communicating now that are also rapid. So these cultural shifts and changes we share on social media. We share the experience of seeing a video of, a new interesting robot, or watching a movie that presents new things, and we share our ideas about it. So we come to these conclusions and we bounce ideas off, and sometimes they're interesting, fun ideas, and sometimes they're conspiracies. Sometimes they're misunderstandings that get spread, like thinking that a robot is. This is one that, and you and I have talked about before, seeing robots perform tasks and overestimating their intelligence because it's not explained in the video. Um, and that makes people alarmed. They're like, oh my God, the robots are taking over the world. But they don't realize that the robot is remote controlled, and it might be very nimble and functional engineering wise, but it's not super smart yet. But what I'm saying is there's so much going on between the rapid leaps and bounds in technology and the rapid ways we communicate about it too, is making really interesting sets of phenomena now, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was a couple of weeks ago in Linz at Ars Electronica, they had the big dog there, and it was interesting to see like they presented the big dog, because I don't even know, there was some collaboration between MIT and the guys who did Big Dog, and they presented it and as an art piece or something like that. And it was interesting to see like how people, they couldn't really interact with Big Dog because it was almost like in a little kettle. Like it was like people could look at it and it was like walking around, but people couldn't interact with it. But it was interesting to see how they were talking about Big Dog, because they already had a perception from the internet. They knew it. It's the thing that you can kick and never falls over and stuff like that. And it was cool to see like a bunch of like adult people like speculating about what they would do with Big Dog if they could get into the kettle.
Yeah, yeah, probably a lot of kicking, like you
Yeah,
said. Yeah,
absolutely. There's something, I don't know, like humans like to kick things. I don't know why.
they like to test things. And in some ways, I think too, when they do things like that, they test themselves, because they're kicking it not only to see if they can kick it over, and they're kicking it to see what its reaction will be. Will it fall? Will it not fall? Will it scream in pain? Will it cry? Will it bite me? Will it attack me? Will lasers shoot from its eyes? But some of that is also, will I feel bad after I kick it? If it starts crying, will I feel terrible, or will I comfort it? What if it does bite me? Will I be angry at it? Does it make sense to be angry at a robot if that's just what it's programmed to do? So there's a lot of, I don't think it's very well expressed curiosity, but I think that it's really complex reasons that people abuse robots, as we've seen with things like Hitchbot, or in different clinical experiments with robots in malls and things like that, where people do go up and, you know, like you said, are violent towards the
Yeah,
robot.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, the you have a really good point there when you say that it probably will take some time for us to have those experiences of being able to test technology in a certain way and to kind of like feel it up in a certain way.
Yeah, and if you are in a situation like you're talking about, where there is a crowd around too, how others react that are witnessing what you're doing and interacting, is part of how you're going to how you're going to act in the future, how they're going to all act. I mean, going back to the kicking thing again, if you went up and kicked the robot dog and it fell and the crowd cheered, right? Then that person, or you, if you kicked them, might feel like a hero and either keep kicking them or just modeled that behavior, right? That got positive feedback. If you kick it, everyone's like, no, or ew, or don't do that, or why would you do that? Then that changes your behavior as well. So it's not just your internal stuff or even the robot's reaction. It's that social, cultural feedback that you're getting as well. And all of that changes all the time, which is one reason it's such a difficult field of study. And I sometimes in industry, I think people that work in industry are a little afraid of exploring these sides because it can seem difficult to get your arms around. Like, where do you begin to study something like this? Like you were saying, there's bodies of scholarly work on each little niche part of these phenomena, right? Very complex sets of interactions.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So if we take the history of computing and robotics, and it's not that old. I mean, like if you go back to, I don't know, like Babbage's like difference engine or something like that, to the, like, let's say like mid 1800s or something like that. That's also around the time that photography and moving images start. So there is kind of like the same time frame for cinema as we have for robotics and AI and computerization. It seems that uh, the jumps we made in computerization are way higher than we did in the narrative elements of telling stories, visual stories about those machines.
Yeah, and some of that might just be the stories that have been chosen to be told, right?
Mhm.
There could be all kinds of creative, interesting, I think that there are out there, science fiction written by more obscure authors, written by women. You don't see a lot of women written things that are produced as big movies in science fiction. People of color, when we see more diversity in Hollywood, if we're talking about Hollywood in particular, we're going to see more diversity of stories. So, and you see it even in international films. If you watch international science fiction, right, which I do, I'm a big fan of sci-fi all over the world, then you do see different perspectives and different framings. I wish Hollywood would open up a little to these other lenses, these other, I guess to use a cinematic term, these other ways of looking at the world, because there are so many ways to tell these stories. But you're right that I think it's also very typical of Hollywood to keep going back to what they think is safe, and to do pre-audience testing, and they're like, oh look, stuff blew up and this is a very cool CGI robot and it's got a big movie star in it, or it's got a very sexy robot and there's a nude scene, or there's a seduction or a romance in it. They keep going for the stereotypical Hollywood stories.
Yeah, and also very formulaic in a way.
Hmm?
Yeah. Also very like a formula, like very
Oh yeah, oh yeah,
formulaic.
totally.
Yeah,
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's rare that you see Hollywood break from that. It's an unfortunate thing, right?
yeah, yeah. They want, as you say, they wanna play the safe game. So because especially in science fiction, there is a lot of money you usually invest in a product like a movie, and you want to get that money back. So you play it safe. Yeah, which is especially uh, sad because the movies are such a mass form of artistic expression. So many, it has almost no barrier. Like going into a gallery is too much for some people. My mother would never go into a gallery. She would say, like, I don't know what to wear, I'm not going into the gallery. But she would go to see a movie. So and not that many people read anymore. So, like, how do you tell the stories, the important stories, and how you bring that to the people? And that is still movies, and it's still audiovisual forms of art, and most of it is a little bit boring. It is just like
And we may see some of that change with uh, the death of theaters, right? I mean, between, I don't know about abroad, but here in the United States, we've had theaters closed for a long time due to the pandemic, slow reopening. I'm not even sure where we're at. Mixed feelings about it reopening. Of course, some people are anxious to get back into the theaters. Some people are like, I've been watching on my big screen TV at home, and you know what? Not only is it fine, but it's quiet, and I can eat popcorn, and I'm not spending as much money. But the medium, the actual physical space, the environment, the experience in which people see movies is different now, right? It's often in their homes. In the United States, that might be feasibly as long as this pandemic is still rolling out here and things are dangerous. And even when theaters reopen, people are going to be reluctant to go back. Theaters are an expensive experience, at least here they are. They're very expensive to go to attend, to buy the snacks at, all of that people complain about. And the experience itself can often be unpleasant. People, because they're used to watching in their living room, often have sort of obnoxious behaviors in movie theaters, right? Looking at their phones, the little light screen, or talking, things like that, that can interrupt that pure movie experience where your goal is to get lost in the story, not be distracted by other people. So when your experience at home is very different, right? Much more controlled, hopefully, right? And even though you might have a big screen and still might enjoy watching explosions and chases and all of those things, the whole experience, but you can also stop and start it, right? You can watch a movie in 3 or 4 different parts. The kids or whatever is getting out of control, you can send them to bed and stop the movie and watch the next night or a week later. I mean, it might have commercials in it. The experience is so different that might change the storytelling as well. They might find that they have to find different ways to catch people's attention other than explosions or the same old stories. That would be nice, right? If they went to some of these more interesting ways of telling stories other than going back to it's essentially the Frankenstein story over and over again,
Yeah,
a
yeah.
creationist story.
I'm wondering now that the production of content is a lot cheaper than 10, 15 years ago, and people are kind of used to watching a lot of stuff, like binge watching, 5 seasons of, I don't know, Game of Thrones or whatever,
Yeah.
uh, or Westworld or whatever it is. I have the feeling that, oh, I hope that out of this, like being at home and being able to control what you're doing way more closely than in a theater, that it might lead to a resurgence of like interactive fiction and interactive storytelling, where you kind of like pick different ways of stories, and like, do you want to turn left or right, the whole idea of interactive fiction. uh, of course, it's kind of part of like the gaming world, of course, because games are pretty much like that. But also the classic way of like, you pick and choose your adventure story. It would be
And
something
that
really
makes you
cool.
active, right? That
Yeah,
makes you an active part of the story. And and some people enjoy that a lot, or enjoy it in small doses or every now and then, and some people would never want to use that. Though I think it's definitely one of those options. I think Netflix played with a Black Mirror episode that sort
uh,
of did that, right?
it's the only thing that I know that tried something like that, and as
I
far as I
think
can
there was
remember.
something else recently, but I can't think of the name of it. But so I'll pretend that there wasn't. But yeah, I think yes, Netflix had that which I started to watch, but I don't think it worked with. I think I was watching it on Roku or something, and it didn't work with what I was using to stream it.
No.
But it was an interesting premise. Um, yeah, you're right, though. I think it does turn it very much into a game. And I think it's going to have to be a lot more sophisticated and a lot smoother. It's going to have to be almost like a game where, in that, the examples that I'm thinking of that you're talking about are sort of clunky ways of doing it. Which way would you go? Something's got to come on the screen to prompt you or something
Yeah.
like that. And that again takes you out of the story for a moment so you can insert yourself into it. And then you are co-creating the story, which is fun, but it's almost not storytelling, then it's co-creation, which is just as valid and can be just as much fun and just as immersive, but it's a different experience, right?
Yeah. It could be fun to use kind of like sensors or something like when if your heart rate does a certain thing or I don't even know like that it's auto generating the next part of the story by how you physically react to a story or something. I don't know, but
No,
uh,
yeah, you could do stuff like that. Like eye tracking comes to mind for me from a tech point of view is one of the lowest hanging fruit because there's so much in eye tracking technology already. But then the ethics part of me says no, 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 because they would have to collect so much biological data from you that could potentially give the. I wouldn't want to give any company, let alone a Hollywood company, my TV provider, whatever it is, all of that information about my visceral reactions, about my heart rate, about what appeals to me or doesn't appeal to me, about my decision making in a story, because then they extrapolate all that data, they make guesses about it, they try to triangulate it with other data that they either have or they purchase about you. And that's not a conspiracy, that's the truth. That's what, otherwise that all that data they collect would be very expensive for them and it would just be sitting there, right? And just used for TV shows. And that's not what's done. People gather that data and then use it for targeted ads, for whatever it is. And so it could be very fun, but we are all sort of giving up a certain amount of our privacy and personal lives when we integrate that much technology with sort of these big companies into our lives, our very bodies, right? When you're talking about biological data.
yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much. We're already at the end of our conversation, and it's good that we stopped with a kind of like a cautionary tale or a cautionary like remark of like, hey, there is so much possible out there, but do you really want that? Like, what kind of side effects would that have? And I completely agree. I mean, if I don't know, like Netflix has my biological data, who knows what they do with it? They might sell it to Walmart, and then I get coupons or something. I
Yeah.
don't know,
Yep,
and
exactly.
I don't want
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much from Vienna to San Francisco. It was
Yay.
great
Thank you.
having you on the program again and again being part of B3. And for all of you out there who need more information of your work, we'll put some information into the by text, the footnotes. But who reads footnotes anymore? I don't know.
Yeah, people can find me at, you'll put it in the notes, but people can find me at jgcarpenter.com, my website, or at jgcarpenter on Twitter.
Wonderful.
Yep.
Thank you so much, and have
Thank
a
you.
great rest of your day.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you.